Welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet of the Hudson Institute. Very pleased that you could join us today, and we're particularly pleased to have with us the C-SPAN audience. A couple of minor housekeeping things. Please continue to enjoy your lunch. I do want to mention we have some upcoming events. We will have a panel of economists discussing the AT&T T-Mobile merger with different perspectives in early November. In December, Professor Greg Roston of Stanford University will come to speak about universal service. I have a couple of other speakers, and we're working on getting exact dates for them. But today is the main event, and we are extremely pleased to have with us Jim Miller, who has a very distinguished career in Washington, holding a variety of positions, and I think today he has one of his most challenging positions on the Board of Governors of the U.S. Postal Service. Jim Miller has previously served as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, as director of the Office of Management and Budget. He has served on countless boards, but I do think one of his most challenging positions has to be the U.S. Postal Service. And I also want to particularly emphasize that this is the Center for the Economics of the Internet, and we're very pleased that Jim Miller is a PhD economist, has written more than 100 scholarly publications, 9 books, and if anyone is in a position to understand the economics of the Postal Service, it is Jim Miller. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jim Miller today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Hudson Institute, where I count among the leading lights 2 of my former colleagues from the Office of Management and Budget, Michael Horowitz, John Weicker, and I have other friends here. Thank you for inviting me. It's quite an honor. Today I'll summarize the dilemma facing the U.S. Postal Service and then take questions. My basic message, or our message in a nutshell, is that the old business model is broken and must be replaced. And then I'll tell you why. But first, a disclaimer. What I say today are my own personal views. They don't necessarily reflect the views of the management of the Postal Service or of the Postal Service's Board of Governors. As you may know, there was an old post office department, and it was the outgrowth of an authorization contained in the U.S. Constitution. It sometimes says that the Constitution mandates a postal service. It does not. It authorizes a postal service. But clearly from the very beginning there was perceived to be a nexus between the federal government and a postal service. Benjamin Franklin was the very first Postmaster General established under the old Continental Congress. In 1792, Congress passed, the President signed a bill called usually referred to as the Private Express Statutes, which outlaws competition with the Postal Service. Postal Service then was granted a monopoly on the delivery of letter mail back in 1792. And as a result of that, the Justice Department enforced that law and put out of business incipient competitors, including the old Pony Express that didn't last very long because it was put out of business by the federal government. The Postal Service was an organization which responded to a lot of congressional pressures to hire this person or that person. The Postmaster General was typically the President's most important political advisor. It was patronage carried to a national level, and partly for that reason it was a pretty inefficient operation. And in fact, something that most people don't know is that up until the late 60s, the Postal Service received outright appropriations, subsidies for its services. In 1970, after a bipartisan commission made a report, the Postal Service, by law, was converted from the old Post Office Department to the Postal Service, a government-sponsored enterprise that was, among other things, meant to be run like a business, make a profit, a small profit. You weren't supposed to make big profits, supposed to spread the goodies around, but it was supposed to operate like a business. Until recently, that is the last decade or so, the operating model of the Postal Service was very simple. It was a statutory monopoly, and the Postal Service was to take the profits from the monopoly portion of its service, that is the delivery of letter mail, and subsidize everything else. So you had a lot of services being delivered at below cost, any kind of attribution of some fully allocated cost. Let me just comment, historically, it's very difficult to get your arms around costs for the Postal Service because, among other reasons, you got to talk about classes of mail delivered everywhere in the country. You've got enormous fixed obligations, so typically attributable cost, or what economists might call marginal cost, are significantly below fully allocated costs. And there's a dilemma, because if you price everything above attributable cost, you're unlikely to if that's your goal, you're unlikely to cover the full cost of service. So that was the model. Profits on letter mail subsidize everything else. And arguably, this was efficient. If you go back and look at the microeconomic literature and see what would be optimal for a price-constrained monopolist with significant scale economies, you would get Ramsey pricing. You know what that is. It was efficient second-order conditions, and you would get something approximating the rate structure that the Postal Service experienced until a few years ago. But in the last decade or so, the demand for monopoly mail, basically letter mail, has been shifting to the left. Volume started falling in 2002 and appears to be coming, and the demand curve for the monopoly mail appears to be becoming more elastic. Now, why is that? Well, it's because of electronic communication. And it's not only email, but it is electronic bill paying. I dare say that the number of electronic messages now dwarfs the number of letter mail messages every day. Dwarfs it. In my own experience, I know that's the case. I send far more electronic messages than I send letter mail messages. So, now that's not to say that the Postal Service volume of mail need fall, because you could have a big burgeoning of total messages. In fact, that's what we've experienced, big burgeoning of total messages. But these electronic messages have eaten into the Postal Service's first-class mail, and I see no reason to believe that that is going to turn around. Now, one reason that the first-class mail volume has fallen has been the recession. And early on in the process, where we started clanging the bell, the Postal Board of Governors, among other people, started clanging the bell saying something's wrong here, we got to do something, is because there was a recession. A lot of folks said, that's the problem. It's not anything fundamental. It's not a systemic problem. Demand hasn't really changed. It's just a product of the recession. But cooler heads, more analytical people, looked at it closely and recognized that there was this diversion going on and it would not end. So what do you do? What do you do when you have a model where all of this losing service is being undergirded by profits on one class of mail, which constitutes about half of the total revenue, but when that revenue, the net revenue, is disappearing. There's the withering away of this monopoly return, and there's nothing to offset it. Now that's a simple explanation. Now what do you do about this? I mean, how do you address these kinds of problems? Well, people say, well, why don't you just raise rates? Now we economists, including people in this room, know that just raising rates doesn't necessarily increase profits, right? You know, if you have a monopoly and you've got the right price, the profit maximizing price, if you increase it from there, you earn less profit, more, et cetera. So just the simple answer that you can raise rates is not always the accurate answer. And a lot of people don't think beyond the notion that, well, you just raise rates. But in any event, could you raise rates? Well, in 2006, Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enforcement Act, which liberalized some of the Postal Service's restraints. In particular, gave it some authority to manage its competitive products, primarily products in competition with FedEx and UPS, but didn't really change the other. In fact, made it more difficult to change or to alter the rest of the services, including the services that were losing the most money. It put a limit on the rate increases by class of service, and in fact said you couldn't raise rates more than the CPI. Now that seems like it's sort of straightforward, good sense. You've got a monopoly, you're going to have a restraint on the rates increases that could obtain. But what? Well, if you limited the CPI and you've got a lot of services for which the price is far below even attributable costs, you're in a box, because you can't raise the prices on losing services, you know, very much. So you got to keep providing these services and you lose on every item. But the theory is you make it up on volume. I don't think so. I don't think so. So that is a problem. Another provision of this law, by the way, you find this interesting, legally requires the Board of Governors to establish rates so that those rates cover all costs of the service for each class of service. So you're in a position where one part of the law says you can't raise rates more than this amount, and another part of the law says you're really supposed to raise rates this amount. Now what do you do in that situation? I mean, if you're an elected official sworn to uphold the Constitution, follow the laws of the land, you're in a pickle. We're all the governors are facing that dilemma right now. We're violating one part of that law or another part of that law. So that's a difficulty. Now, there is a provision for what's called an exigent rate increase when there are significant, unexpected, dramatic reductions in the outlook and reductions in performance because of unanticipated factors. Suppose there were pray God that doesn't happen, but another anthrax scare or another 9/11 or something like that. I mean, it's not what an economist would say would be a good solution, you know, but you do have the authority to go to the Postal Rate Commission and ask for a rate increase or exception from this cap. We recently asked for an increase based on the recession, and and the Postal Rate Commission, now Postal Regulatory Commission it's called under the 2006 legislation, said no. It doesn't constitute what is required for showing of unanticipated, significant, whatever the legislative language is. But that decision was overturned on appeal, or partially overturned on appeal. We don't know what's going to happen there. Also, even quite aside from that, we have difficulty changing rates. If we want to change rates, part of the reason is that we would want to let our customers know that the rates are going to be changed in advance so they could gear up, you know, and change their meters and all that. But we have to go to the PRC, the Postal Regulatory Commission, 45 days at least ahead of time for them to do a proceeding to find out whether it's okay to change those rates. Now, I can imagine a company out there. Suppose you're 7-Eleven, you want to raise the price of Altoids. I get a lot of Altoids, okay. So you go in there. And, you know, I mean, is it going to be $1.89 or $2.25, you know? And suppose you had to go to some kind of government agency and file a bunch of paper ahead of time and get some kind of decision. Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense with the Postal Service either, in my judgment. So even those rates for competitive products, say rates that are in competition with UPS and with FedEx, we have under the new laws authority to make some changes in those. But the PRC then has a proceeding in which they can make a determination that the prices are below attributable cost and are unlawful. So you have that hanging over your head. Now, what about reducing costs? Obviously, that's profit is the difference between revenue and cost. One way to get out of a bind is to increase revenue. The other way is to reduce cost. Well, the Postal Service run a logistics network. We're with a nod toward UPS, which advertises this, uses the word, we are in the logistics business, right? So think of this. The economy is constantly changing. That's one of the wonderful things about our economy. It responds to different consumers. Consumers change about what their preferences are and where they want to live and from which retailers they want to buy things, etc. So our need is to be able to adapt to those changing patterns. But we have in the law requirements to give advance notice for any kind of change, and that gives Congress an opportunity to insert NIMBY, you know what NIMBY is, not in my backyard, provisions in appropriations or other essential legislation, or just simply threaten to do that. So it makes it difficult for us to make those kinds of changes. Similarly with post offices. We have about 36,000 post offices, only about 6,000 of which earn revenue for that post office more than the cost of operating that post office. Now imagine you're Walmart and you're told, I don't care if you don't make any money on this, you've got to keep this store open. Well, yeah, but the bridge is out and they're not going to fix it for 3 years. No, doesn't matter. You've got to keep this open. Well, I mean, just multiply that by tens of thousands and you can see what a problem that we're in. There is also problems of changing delivery. At Walmart, it could be open from 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock, or 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock, or even 24 hours. But that decision is up to Walmart. Or McDonald's. Some of them are open 24 hours, some of them are open for a very short period, much shorter period of time, etc. The market determines that. People who own these stores or run these stores have the responsibility. They're looking at consumer demands. They say, consumers don't want to come in here between 10 o'clock at night and 5 o'clock in the morning. Why keep the lights on? Why pay people to stand back here and keep the grill going? So you close it down. We don't have that authority. We can't just eliminate those kinds of operations or change the hours or change the frequency of delivery. That's a big issue right now. There is provision in current law that requires us to provide 6-day-a-week service. Current law is an appropriations rider every year that requires us to provide service 6 days a week. Now, it wasn't always that way. In fact, it was the other way around. When I was a kid, when I was growing up in the 1800s, we got delivery in my little town in Conyers, Georgia, my home Conyers, Georgia. We got the mail delivery twice a day. You ever heard of that? We got delivery twice a day. Now, that hasn't been the case for a long time. But people get delivery once a day. Well, I'll just tell you, as a business proposition, there are places that ought to get delivery of mail 6 days a week. There are other places that ought to get mail delivery 5 days a week. And there are other places that ought to get mail delivery 3 days a week. And some places maybe 1 day a week. Do you know we deliver mail at the bottom of the Grand Canyon? We have them on mules, take the mail down there and all that. Now, there are different, I don't mean that people want to live in the Grand Canyon. God bless them, you know. But, I mean, there are enormous costs. And, ladies and gentlemen, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So, if people are imposing big costs on the system, somebody's paying for it. And it's the ratepayers for others. And when you are in a situation where 20, 30 years ago you had a lot of profits from the delivery of first-class mail, you could subsidize that kind of system. It's not there now. It's simply not there. So that means there are going to be big losses racked up. There's also a problem of labor cost. Now, labor costs are 80% of our total cost. 80%. Now, why is that a big problem? Well, I mean, you know, it could be 90%. I'm not taking issue with the 80% number. But we do have two problems that experts, econometricians who are much more facile about Durbin-Watson statistics and multi-correlation and, you know, and autocorrelation and all that stuff, that doesn't have anything to do with automobiles. It's statistical testing of, you know, statistical properties of, you know, of models, etc. Well, but they conclude that, number one, the current employees, both those that distribute mail inside a facility, you know, that are involved with channeling the mail, and those who actually walk the beat, are getting a premium. The total cost, including benefits, is higher than would be the case in the private sector. And secondly, because of the constraints contained historically in the contracts and the constraints that are mandated by law. And there's some constraints mandated by law. You have to give them this and this and this, that currently they're earning a significant premium. Now, I'm not against anybody earning good money, absolutely. But on the other hand, when you have monopoly mail making a great profit, you can distribute it around, you can get along with that. But not now, because we don't have the profits from first-class mail to distribute around to losing services. So it would be possible for us to do a lot better if we were able to obtain contracts with our two major unions, the Postal Workers Union and the Letter Carriers Union, which provided, number one, lower basic compensation, number one, and number two, a great deal more flexibility. The board went out and visited the facilities of UPS and FedEx. They have a big peaking problem. I don't know if you know about this, but they have all these things, they collect them around the country, and they all go into Memphis for FedEx, you know, and they have, starting about 1 o'clock in the morning, have all these big planes landing. I mean, it's just pandemonium. They have all this stuff on there, you know. Well, their peakedness problem is greater than ours, but we do have a peak problem. But what they do is they hire a lot of college students to come in and work 4-hour shifts. They have another peak in the morning. We have peak problems as well, but for all practical purposes still, we have to pay people an 8-hour day on an 8-hour day basis. We can't hire people for 4 hours. I say practical purposes, there is some flexibility in the newest contract. Now, why can't we get revision in pay scales and also some freeing up of these work rules. Well, there's a special law that applies to labor relations in the Postal Service. It says that management and employees negotiate, and if there is an impasse, it goes to compulsory arbitration. All right? The history of compulsory arbitration has been that that organized labor gets pretty much what it asks for. For that reason, we recently signed with the APWU and gave them a great number of concessions, including an extension of the provision for no layoffs, but they gave in return some reductions in freezing the salaries and wages for a short period, etc. So we have a labor law that's driving this. It's not that the Postal Service says, oh, give them whatever they want. We have something that's driven by law. Well, despite all these problems, the Postal Service has been doing all it can to reduce costs, to streamline the system, to have a more efficient logistical network. And we have reduced costs by quite a lot, but not as much proportionally as the reduction in total mail volume. What more could be done? Well, in March of 2010, the Postal Board of Governors and the Postmaster General announced a plan based on our intensive study of these issues for about 8 months of really intensive work after sounding alarms for some time. And it required some reform in delivery frequency, some restraints on workforce compensation and freeing up work rules, some pricing flexibility, and things of this nature. One proposal that has been floated by academics has been to demonopolize and privatize the Postal Service, right? That's a solution that's frequently offered. Let me tell you, when I was budget director, I sat down across the cabinet room table with President Reagan and said to President Reagan, Mr. President, in this budget I prepared for you, I propose that we demonopolize and privatize the Postal Service. His reaction was, well, Jim, that sounds like a good idea. Now, I found subsequently, when this book that Annalise Anderson and Karen Skinner and Marty Anderson published in his own hand, based on his radio addresses, that he had given a radio address saying virtually the same thing, which is an example, by the way. You know, he had a plaque on his desk said, you know, you'd be surprised how much progress you can make if you don't care who gets the credit. Wasn't that was an example of that, rather than saying, oh, well, Jim, I proposed this 4 years ago or something like that. He didn't say that. He said, that's a good idea. So we put it in there. And of course, there was no progress on that proposal at all. There was massive opposition. I couldn't get anyone on the Hill really interested in that proposition. And that situation prevails today. There is no constituency for privatization and demonopolization. None. Dana Rohrabaugh, a congressman, former associate of mine in the White House, and now congressman from California, puts in a bill nearly every year saying, let's give the Postal Service to the employees. And the unions fight that tooth and nail. Well, I mean, not surprised. If you had the current system, right, and you offer, and the Postal Service were offer an IPO, what kind of price do you think it would bring? Zero. It's not an ongoing proposition. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, if the Postal Service were an ordinary corporation, today it would be in Chapter 11, perhaps Chapter 9. The Postal Service is flatly bankrupt. Now, I hate to say that. I don't know whether that'll create news or not. I've said it before. So changes have to be made. Now, but basically that is a non-starter. We could do some reform of the labor law. One proposal has been that the arbitrators should take into account the financial condition of the Postal Service. To me, this is not an elegant solution because it shouldn't matter, you know. The Postal Service and organized labor should be able to contest these things and solve it. So, but that's one thing that might improve the situation. Another might be to relax what is called the universal service obligation. There is for the Postal Service a requirement by Congress that it provides service everywhere in America, everywhere in America. There's some places where you need to provide service. And there are other places where it makes no economic sense for us to be providing service. People say, well, you know, without the universal service organization obligation, there would be massive reductions in service, et cetera. People never get their mail, et cetera. Those same arguments were used against trucking deregulation. I remember the American Trucking Association put out a volume in the Ford administration where they had a model that showed all of these services in the small town Michigan. How did they pick Michigan? I don't know. Services in Michigan would disappear, right? All those predictions didn't happen. Same thing with airline deregulation. Forecast without the universal service obligation and control of the airlines by the Civil Aeronautics Board, massive reductions in service. People wouldn't be able to get air. Didn't happen. In fact, just the reverse happened. Much more service than before. So I suspect that would be the case if you had elimination of the USO for the Postal Service. Neither FedEx nor UPS has any kind of universal service obligation. Their service is ubiquitous, right? Do you have trouble finding a UPS or FedEx? No. But they have some flexibility where they locate their provisions, their frequency. For example, I live in Rappahannock County, Virginia. FedEx and UPS don't deliver on Saturday. I know that. And for that reason, I can make provisions. I can always go to the central place and pick up what I need. And in fact, the Postal Service has proposed that we, given the authority to reduce service and the question of 6 versus 5, we would keep the post offices open. So if you had something, people say, well, there'll be people getting medicine on Saturdays, and they would go without the medicine. Well, they could go to the post office and get the medicine instead of having it delivered to them. By the way, the Postal Regulatory Commission recently finished a study where they found that the universal service obligation cost the Postal Service $4.4 billion each year. The monopoly on the letter mail, they estimated, benefits the Postal Service $3.5 billion each year. There might be a deal there. I mean, eliminate the requirement for the USO, and in exchange we give up the monopoly on letter for the mailbox and the letter mail. The PRC could put more classes of mail in the competitive category. We have some first-class mail that's still regulated under the old system, and it's just in direct competition with UPS and FedEx. That ought to be in the competitive category. In any event, there's legislation to consider dealing with these issues. The Postal Service was supposed to have paid the federal government $5.5 billion on September 30th. I said publicly last March, it ain't going to happen. We will default. And people, you can't say that. I said, yeah, I can. I'm chairman of the audit committee. I can do anything I want. I'm going to say it. U.S. government will default. I mean, the Postal Service will default on its obligation to the U.S. government. Now, what happened is in the CR, y'all know what a CR is? What's kind of budget speak, you know, CR. You know how to say that, you know, go to these cocktail parties. Well, I know about the CR. I mean, they'll think you're smart, right? CR means continuing resolution. They postponed the date till November 18th, so we wouldn't technically be in default. But, I mean, we don't have any money. I mean, it's just not there. I mean, unless they do something, we're going to default. You know, they just keep pushing the date back. The president recently came out and said he was in favor of restructuring retiree health benefit funding. Everybody agrees. I mean, virtually everybody agrees that we have overpaid for retiree health benefits, and we need to change that. Federal employee retirement system, we've overpaid that, and so some notion of getting a refund there. And the president is supporting some flexibility in our delivery requirements. There are specific bills. Congressman Issa has a bill in the House, Congressman Lynch, Congressman Cummings. In the Senate, there are bills by Senators Lieberman, Carper, Collins, and Senator McCain. And among other things, they would provide the establishment of a federal financial control board in case we defaulted, and their change worker compensation rules and so forth and so on. So in conclusion, I know Harold's trying to get me to quit.
No.
In conclusion, there are a lot of smart people within the Beltway who are groping for a solution that would establish a model that works. And that's good, because the old model, the old business model, doesn't work. And in my opinion, the Postal Service must be given more freedom to operate as a business if it's to remain part of the broader postal market and avoid substantial continuing subsidies from the federal government. I appreciate your time and attention, and there I'll stop and answer questions.
Jim, if I can take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question.
Sure.
Could you describe for the audience the structure of the governing bodies for the postal system? You referred to a postal regulatory commission.
Right.
I'm just curious, do they have any responsibilities other than regulating a government-appointed board for the?
Right. Let's start with the Postal Service organization. The Postal Service is headed by a Postmaster General and a Deputy Postmaster General that are chosen by a Board of Governors. The Board of Governors consists of, for most purposes, 11 members, including the Postmaster General and the Deputy Postmaster General. Obviously, when we choose a Deputy or a Postmaster General, they don't get to vote. But the members of the Postal Board of Governors are 9 in number, are chosen by the President, nominated by the President, and confirmed by the Senate, like lots of other folks. Those jobs are part-time jobs, but I'll tell you, I serve on a number of boards, and none take as much time as this one. And none pay less than this one. Okay? So there's a Board of Governors, and they are the equivalent of a Board of Directors. You like having a Board of Directors, but the Board of Directors doesn't have the same authority as they would have in the private sector. Okay, so you've got this. Then there is a Postal Regulatory Commission. These are 5 members nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. No more than a bare majority can be of one political party. And they're full-time jobs. And they produce research on the Postal Service, figure out how the Postal Service works or doesn't work, but also have decision-making authority on whether we can raise rates or lower rates, how the rates have to be structured, etc. So every time we every time we want to do something in that area, we have to turn it over to them for them to make a decision. I'm simplifying somewhat, but basically, our major decisions have to be reviewed by these 5 commissioners. So that's basically the way it works.
Good. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. We have a microphone, and when you ask a question, please identify yourself, and so that the audience can know who it's coming from. Why don't we start over here?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think part of your question is sort of rhetorical.
Will you identify yourself?
Oh, sure. My name is Todd Wiggins, and I'm an internet videographer, a blogger, etc., and I use the internet for free. So I think part of your response is a bit rhetorical, because we know that if the money's shifting over to Google and Yahoo and Hotmail, that the post office, or the Postal Service, needs to mimic what is going on over there, and because that is, as you pointed out, mail delivery. That's where a lot of mail delivery's gone. So could the Postal Service integrate some of those same strategies that these internet providers do in delivering virtual mail? Or will I end up having to pay for my Hotmail in the future? Because that seems like that's coming down the pike. Will I have to pay for my YouTube in the future because the government will tax it? So those, I think you've obviously thought of those, your board's obviously thought of those methods. And then when you said that you were thinking about, well, talked about raising the cost of mail, well, I understand that I'm going to have to pay more for mail. I mean, I may have to pay $50 for a regular delivery because you're not making a profit, so therefore I assume that I'm going to have to take on that burden. So I think it's realistic that the American public is going to see some changes, and it's not going to be pretty or palpable, but you're going to have it, right?
Mr. Wiggins, that's a good question. Let me say we have done some very preliminary work on expanding into the digital area. We're not in a position to talk about it much because it is so premature, it'd be premature to do that. But we have thought about this and are addressing that as well. On the internet side, let me just say, as a person who is a user of internet, I think had the federal government regulated heavily the internet, we would be at the position of dial-up, and something called broadband would be studied by Hudson and other places, and there would be such vested interest against it that it would not take place for a long time. So the fact that the internet was not regulated by the federal government enabled it to advance at such a great pace. There are obviously problems still at the margin about the regulation and deregulation of internet space, and I don't want to opine on that as well. In terms of prices, a lot of people say that postal delivery is a terrific bargain. You know, where else can you send a piece, something from here today, you know, and have it delivered in Cupertino? I don't know why I'm just thinking of Cupertino. Maybe it's because I just bought a Mac Air.
That's right.
But I mean, it's a great value. But I mean, maybe the price has to go to 65 cents. I'm just guessing. Don't, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm just using that as total hypothetical. But I mean, right, I mean, people might have to pay more. Interestingly, though, I want to mention the point about delivery frequency. Poll after poll shows that when people are asked, would you like to have reduced delivery frequency from 6 days a week to 5 days a week? People say, no, I want it 6 days a week. I said, would you rather have 5 day a week delivery, or you have a, you know, pay a dime more for a stamp? I always say 5 day delivery is fine with me. So I mean, it's like so much polling information where you don't give them the price of of the choices. You know, they'll tend to pick something that's for free, but it's not free. There's no free lunch there. We got to make hard choices.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Weinstein, president of Hudson Institute. Delighted to welcome Jim Miller, longtime champion of free market ideas to Hudson. Very good to see you here.
Good.
This subject has actually been one of longtime interest to Hudson Institute. If Herman Kahn, who founded Hudson Institute
Right.
50 years ago, in 1961, passed away in 1983. You read the Encyclopedia Britannica for 1984. You look at the obituary for Herman Kahn, and it notes that at the time of Kahn's death, Kahn was increasingly obsessed with the possibility of the electronic transmission of mail. So something we have been thinking about, and our colleagues have been thinking about for a long time. As you look at the significant changes that have gone on that you discussed, has the commission at all, or you personally, looked at overseas examples of postal services that have made the kind of transformations necessary to bring themselves into the modern age? Obviously, in Europe, in the past few years, we've seen the sale of the telephone side of a number of the PTTs for European regulatory purposes, and I'm just wondering what you've seen on the postal side, and if there are any examples that are particularly worth following in this new age.
Let me again speak for myself. I am very concerned about the Postal Services extending its reach right now. The notion that somehow we're going to be able to jump into banking or jump into electronic transmission and make a huge profit in competition with the private sector is nuts. I mean, you're not going to do that. I mean, I would say the same thing if I were in another company. I mean, if I were in a company that says, oh, well, the way out of our deep hole is to jump into new lines of product. It's nuts. So over time, we may get into some of these things. We have paid a lot of attention to what Europe has done, et cetera. Part of it is a lot of the postal services in Europe, the predicate for them is much different than in the United States. They were, I mean, take for example in Japan, they were part of the banking system, et cetera. So I'm concerned about that. On the other hand, there are opportunities there, and we ought to be very aware of them and look at the evidence on those experiments and take advantage of them where we can. Michael in the back.
Hi, Hans Kuttner from Hudson Institute. I understand on a commercial entity that's in crisis, how the end game plays out. You know, I guess the treasurer walks in one day and says, okay, our cash may be out tomorrow, and the general counsel says, okay, call the law firm that has our chapter whatever proceeding ready to file, kind of thing. But this is a different world. Chapters whatever of the bankruptcy code don't apply. You've got the full faith and credit, I guess, of the Treasury. So can you help us understand the analogy between this and a ordinary commercial enterprise that might be in crisis? And, and does this ever have to sort of hit an endpoint, or can the can just be kicked down the road by Treasury?
It can't be kicked down by Treasury. It can't be kicked down the road by the Postal Service. It can be kicked down by the President and Congress. Have to change the law. The Postal Service is limited by law to borrowing from the federal government no more than $15 billion. We are at $15 billion. Ain't another dime we can borrow. Right? Treasury can't do anything about that. That's one law. Other law is Postal Service can't borrow money from the private sector. That's a law of law. There's a law of economics that says nobody's going to lend the money to the Postal Service if it were to seek to borrow such money, right? So we're in a box there. On terms of further analogy, I mean, the reason we had to decide not to make the payment on September 30th, and the Board of Governors voted we're not going to make the payment and let everybody know. Some people interpreted that as a threat to Congress. It was not a threat. We just want to let you know we're not going to make it. And the reason is we didn't have the money. Yes, we did have about $1 billion. On September 30th, we had about $1 billion. That was sort of the absolute minimum cash balance that allowed us to continue operation, including pay our employees and vendors, right? So we just can't go below that. There's a number that, and I just, I don't want to put him on the spot. I just talked to our CFO this morning, and he looks kind of haggard. I mean, it's a bad situation. You know, you don't have the money, and you are worried every day about making sure that you can pay the bills. Now, the way mail volume works is in October and every October and November, December, it ramps up somewhat. Why? Because of the Christmas season. And the Postal Service's revenues rise more than the increase in costs, rise above the cost line in a way of saying it. And so I think we'll be fine. In fact, we have, as long as we don't have to pay the $5.5 billion due last September, now due November 18th, we'll get through to September 30th, at which time we will default because we owe another $5.5 or so billion on September 30th of 2012. There have been a lot of suggestions for the federal government to kind of bail out the Postal Service here, or bail it out there. I mean, those are one-year things. I mean, for the organization to survive and to be an active and productive participant in the postal market, small p, postal market, we have to have systemic change. The systemic change is to give the Postal Service Board of Governors the authority to respond to market forces as a board of directors of an ordinary company would do. That's my bottom line. Michael.
In the back, Michael Horowitz.
I'm kind of concerned about this. This is Michael Horowitz asking the question.
What would be so apocalyptic, Jim, if the Postal Service went bankrupt? If Congress refused to provide subsidies?
Well, it would not be apocalyptic.
As I sense it, increasingly what the post office is a subsidy operation for junk mailers that in terms of first-class service provides terrible service. Every time I have to go to the post office, I sit around waiting forever. So the question is, why do we need the Postal Service in its current form? Could you spell out for us what the impact on the economy would be if somehow you defaulted and employees did not get paid or vendors didn't get paid and Congress refused to provide the subsidy? How would that impact the American people, the American economy?
Let me state that I understand your predicate is but default means shut down. We defaulted, or we're going to default. That is the payment to the federal government. Even with that default, we would continue operating. But let's just hypothesize that the federal government, the Postal Service shut down. It would not be apocalyptic. There would be, obviously, a lot of employees would be hurt, vendors would be caught short-handed. There would be consequences of that. But let's just look at the consumer side for now. I mean, there are alternatives. I mean, advertisers can use different means of reaching consumers than sending it through the mail. What is called standard mail, what a lot of people call junk mail. There are other avenues. My point is there's a demand out there for vendors who want to communicate advertising messages to consumers that would be standalone. An enterprise would make money and cover costs. And that is basically the market test of whether it makes sense to have such an institution. The problem is there's so many constraints on it right now that it just can't do that. And again, I return, the Postal Service needs to be freed up to provide services and make adjustments and operate as a business enterprise would ordinarily operate. Now, this, Michael, you were there at the White House when the president said, okay, that's a good idea, Jim, right? But the conditions have changed from big monopoly source of inefficiency, of allocative inefficiency, to a situation now that's quite different. My algorithm is try to make the Postal Service operate as an efficient business enterprise. And it can't do that with all of these restraints. I feel like a little bit about, you know, remember reading Gulliver's Travels? How many of y'all read that? Gulliver's Travels. I mean, you know, it's like being tied up by all this, this little rule, that little rule, this rule, and you're tied down, and you get to the point you can't even you can't get up in the morning.
Can I have a brief follow-up, Jim?
Sure.
The problem is it's the labor unions that stand in the way of removing the constraints, and what troubles me is the lack of tough bargaining, and you're a tough bargainer I've seen on the part of the Postal Service itself. Here you said that you don't want to go to arbitration because we'll inevitably lose. I'm not sure you're right on that score. But can't we place far more pressure and leverage and hard choices on the unions? If you block this from happening, if you block that freedom, then this Postal Service is going to go bankrupt, you'll wind up with nothing, and the impact on the economy will not be that substantial. People won't miss it that very much. Why isn't there more of that taking place?
Well, that's what Congressman Issa asked, and Chairman Issa asked. Let me say two things. One, we need flexibility in terms a lot of other ways in which the restraint is not the unions, but the Congress. But on the union side, I mean, I won't divulge the nature of the discussions the governors had about this. But our decision was that the deal that we orchestrated with the APWU was, in terms of expected value, the best we could get. I'm reporting what the governors decided. This was the best we could get, and we bargained hard to get that.
Back corner over here.
Thank you. Rob Colorina, AIC Investments. Jim, we have met previously on the campaign trail. Question is towards the sort of the financial side. In your expenses, could you just estimate how much of that is towards pension obligations, and how much of that is towards operating costs in terms of, you know, your people, your equipment, that type of thing?
Just roughly speaking, from 0 to 100%, wages, direct wages, including the taxes due on the wages and all, probably 80%, and the 20% are benefits, retirement, health care after retirement, things of this nature. Yeah.
So in any situation, if you contracted 5 days, you couldn't touch the pension side, but the other variable expenses, that would be the one affected.
We'd be able to contract. I mean, if you think of roughly in terms of 6 to 5, that's 1/6. That would be an overstatement of the savings you would get for some of the reasons you're pointing out. But there would be substantial savings in the order of $3 or $4 billion. We receive about, roughly speaking, $62 or $63 billion in revenue, and our outlays are about $72 billion. So of the $72 billion, you would get $3 or $4 billion savings, and it wouldn't happen immediately. Part of it would be that the total pool of employees would shrink, but it would shrink over time. Since we have no layoff provisions in most of these contracts, it would have to take place slowly over time. So you wouldn't realize the annual savings so greatly immediately. It would take a while.
Over on the side here.
Oh, another OMB here, John Weicker.
John Weicker, Hudson Institute. Long ago, in the days when we were getting mail twice a day, I started to become a stamp collector.
Yeah.
And like most kids, I stopped. But I always remember that postal officials would say that stamps for collectors were pure profit. Are you still making pure profit? Are you still making money on stamps for collectors?
We are. It's not a whole lot. It's more, I mean, it is, we have we have to carry on our books the liability for stamps we've issued that haven't been redeemed. But part of it's a calculation of what portion of these stamps are in the hands of collectors and will never be redeemed. We had a bit of a problem a couple of years ago because we had to change the method, not to change the methodology, but change the estimates when we started issuing the forever stamp. How many of you like the forever stamp? Well, I'm glad, because I had a lot to do with that. All right? And the Postal Service now thinks it's a great idea, and in fact, I went out and last year and spoke at the unveiling of the new Reagan Centennial stamp. And I should be ashamed of myself. I said, and you know what, if I get my way, this Reagan stamp will be a forever stamp. God's got this wonderful stand-up applause, and I knew we were going to do it already. But it's interesting because the somebody knows how to pronounce it. Philatelic, the philatelist, the philatelic groups were not sure about the forever stamp, and so that's one reason we made them all forever stamps, so it would not disadvantage, you know, that community, and more importantly, continue our flow of profits from that community.
We have time for two more questions here in the middle and then over there.
Hi, Trey Kovacs, Competitive Enterprise Industry. I was just saying, to my knowledge, no legislation deregulates the mailing service like the trucking, airline, or railroads, and they all have a taxpayer bailout. I guess, do you think any current legislation will give flexibility to the post office to meet market demand? And also, ISA contends his bill isn't a taxpayer bailout, but extends the borrowing limit by $10 billion. I was just seeing what you thought.
I don't think Congress is going to give the kind of flexibility I've advocated. They're just not going to do that. Congress looks at the Postal Service as its own enterprise and will control that enterprise, wants to control that enterprise, will grudgingly grant flexibility to the Postal Service if necessary to keep it going without big government subsidies. There are provisions in these various ISA, Carper, Collins, and all bill that if I can pick and choose, won't get me where I was suggesting that we go, but get me down that line a long way, right? Whether they will make those choices or not, I don't know. We've testified, we've positioned ourselves, we've tried to encourage the various staffs to draft things in certain ways, et cetera. The President's been the White House has been very responsive to the concerns we've expressed, but where it'll all come out, I don't know.
And I guess you believe that ISA bill is not a taxpayer bailout?
ISIS bill, I recollect, contains some refunding of the overpayment of FERS, of Federal Employee Retirement System. Actuaries ranging from the big accounting firms to the Postal Regulatory Commission to so forth have concluded that we have overpaid already. Besides that, the schedule of payments continues to overpay because we have a shrinking workforce. 10 years ago, we had about 700,000 full-time employees of the Postal Service. We now have about 450,000 or something like that. So it's shrunk already some. But if you had a schedule predicated on forecast 10 years ago, you'd obviously be overpaying. So I don't characterize that as a bailout. They're bailout. I know bailouts. I recognize bailouts when I see it. Those are not bailouts. And, you know, we may get thrown in at the last minute some solutions like, okay, we'll raise the borrowing limit to $20 billion. Wahoo! That's no solution. That's what I would say that would be a bailout, or just forgiving obligations that are justified would be a bailout. But this is not a bailout. I'm troubled by Chairman Issa's proposal to establish a financial control board. That's what I thought we were doing, you know. That's what our responsibility is. We're the financial control board. I'm chairman of the audit committee. I'm trying to control, the board controls those sorts of things. They have a separate financial control. It's kind of like we've been breaking our back to avoid financial disaster, which could be placed at the feet of all the regulatory and legal restraints that we face, and along come and say, well, you guys haven't done your job, obviously. That's not only not fair, but it just doesn't make any sense.
Last question over here.
Hi, Jeff Waldo. I'm a former Postal Service economist, and my question is, what can citizens do, private citizens? What can we do to help the Postal Service get the flexibility that it needs?
First, buy a lot of stamps, send a lot of mail. Those are always welcome events. I think consumers writing their members of Congress have an effect. Members of Congress, even if they don't read the letters, there's some aide's going to tell, Congress, we got 27 letters yesterday, all of them saying, give the Postal Service some running room so we can continue to have Postal Service without, costing an arm and a leg or something like this. Consumers can really have a big effect. And it's interesting. There have been various surveys done with American citizens. What federal agencies do you have the most integrity? What federal agencies do you admire most? What federal agencies do you have the most confidence in? Postal Service is either number one, number two in most all of those polls. There's a great deal of affinity for the Postal Service. And to preserve this institution, they need to make some changes. Sure, there's going to be somebody like me in Rappahannock County who have to go down to the Postal Service on Saturday to get his mail if he really wants it. I doubt if I drive 5 miles, 4.5. I'm 4.5 miles from my post office. I doubt that I'll go down there the majority of Saturdays. Sometimes I'll be going somewhere nearby, and it might be 2 miles or 1 mile or something like that. But that's a very minor cost to bear for preserving and I'm looking at the efficiency of the market for this kind of service. And whether you call it the U.S. Postal Service, I'm not trying to preserve the U.S. Postal Service in the mindset or in the model that existed 100 years ago. I'm looking at the market for postal services being responsive to evolving consumer demands, and for the organization to survive and provide good service, it needs to have flexibility to respond. That's all I'm asking for.
And with that, been very generous with your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. All right.